Namaskar, everyone. A very, very good evening and very, very warm welcome. We are very delighted to have with us Dr. Rajan Kumar, all the way from New Delhi. And he's a very special guest because he'll be speaking about something which is very, very contemporary. In fact, as we do this conversation, a theater of war has already been in existence for some time in Europe now, and we are aware of the circumstances and the bylines which are happening in Europe. And we are very happy to bring you an expert who teaches Russian history, who teaches Russian and Central Asian international relations and geopolitics, and is deeply involved. Also, is a writer. He writes prolifically, speaks about it on various platforms. Of course, I'll be introducing him formally. But Dr. Rajan Kumar, for being here with us on this platform, I'm extremely grateful to you, deeply humbled and truly honored to have you amongst us to speak to us about the Russian-Ukraine relationships from historical perspective to the current crises. So thank you very much for being with us. Would you like to say something?
Thank you so much, Mugdha. I'm delighted. It's my privilege and honor. Actually, I should be honored for that you are inviting me here. And and the topic is very contemporary. So we'll talk about Russia-Ukraine relationship, and I'll try to give a broad overview from the historical period till the present crisis. So thank you, Mugdha. And I would also like to thank the Literary Society of IS Association Rajasthan. So I'm extremely grateful to the entire team and also Yogesh ji, apart from Mugdha. And thank you, audience. Thank you, everybody, for joining. And we hope to have a very good conversation on this topic. Thank you.
Yeah, so thank you very much, Rajan. Once again, very, very warmly welcoming you. And I also like to very warmly welcome our very, very dedicated and discerning audience who have joined us today. And the audience, as we all know, comprises of not just the civil servants, but also members drawn from the civil society, because the idea of this platform is to be a bridge through dialogue and meaningful conversation between the civil service and the civil society. And that has always been our, purpose to bridge the gap, even if that gap exists only in perception. And I see some friends of yours and ours have also joined the conversation. So very, very warmly welcoming all our very, very discerning audiences. And just for the benefit of all those people who are joining this platform for the first time, I'm very happy to tell you that we have been in existence for the last 4 years. We have done more than 56 sessions. This is our 58th session. So very, very happy to be doing so many sessions. And this can only happen with the support of wonderful authors and speakers and, of course, the audience. So without taking much of your time, because we have an hour and a half to wind up this conversation, let me begin, first of all, by introducing our author and speaker. Dr. Rajan Kumar teaches in the School of International Studies, SIS, at JNU, New Delhi. His latest book, Re-Emerging Russia, was published by Palgrave Macmillan. He writes regularly for the Financial Times and other newspapers on issues of international politics and India's foreign relations. His first book spoke about conflict resolution, a study of Chechnya. He has also studied and taught in the University of Kentucky, Lexington, USA. He has also lived and taught in Moscow for a brief period. He is right now the associate professor at the Center for Russian and Central Asian Studies at SIS in JNU, New Delhi. And with that very brief introduction, I will now invite Rajan and ask him, this entire thing which is going on deserves a lot of attention, because every story that is happening in the current times has a backstory. So I'd like you to take us right into history, deep down into history, because very recently, I think it's The Economist which has come up with a cover page which says that the Stalinization of Russia is happening right now. Yeah. So that's the latest that I saw. So, Rajan, how do you propose to do this? Do you propose to speak, or do you propose to show us a presentation?
Yeah. So what I'm planning to do, Mugdha, thank you, Mugdha. Thank you, everybody. What I plan to do is that I'll give, say, 15 to 20 minutes kind of PPT slide, because I want to show some maps and also some of the historical facts. So I can share in the slide, and after that, we can have a longish Q&A. with you, of course, and also with the audience. And as you said, we can be bilingual, so that's fine. I can speak English and Hindi both. Yeah.
Yes. So while Rajan is doing his PPT sharing for the benefit of the audience, I just want to let everybody know, as Rajan has already told you, that please feel free to ask your questions in English or Hindi. We will try and keep the conversation partly in English and partly in Hindi for wider outreach. And I'll be really grateful if people can start putting down their questions, because we have limited time today. Rajan is here for a very limited time. He's been broached by a lot of the print and the electronic media to give talks on this topic. So his time is very precious for us. So I would really request everybody to start writing their questions so we can pick as many questions as possible after the presentation is over. And Rajan, of course, will be talking of issues, principal actors, timelines, chronology, what it portends for the future, how the maps look, how geography plays a role, and so much more. We'll ask him through the questions after his presentation. Rajan, the floor is all yours now.
All right. Thank you so much, Mugdha. You're always generous in introduction with your speaker. So let me share the slide here, and if you can see, can you see the slide here? Mugdha, can you see? Just confirm once.
Yes, I can see. Yes.
All right. Lovely.
Yeah.
All right. Yeah. So lovely. So these are the broader issues that I'll be talking about today. Crisis, most of you know, you have been reading newspapers, you've been following in the print and electronic media. So I'll not get into too much of contemporary details. I want to bring in something new on the table, and I'll try to give a complexity which has emerged from the history and is not just confined to the last few years. So I'll try to give you a historical background. I'll also try to explain some of the motives of the key actors which are involved in this conflict. And what is the grand strategy, that million-dollar question that all of you have in your mind, that what is the strategy of President Putin, and where is Russia going to stop? So what is the plan? So I'll make a few speculations. Of course, nobody knows about his plan. But yes, I'll try to make a few hypotheses. I'll throw a few hypotheses for your consideration. And then finally, depending on time, we can talk about the crisis resolution in case there is one. If I have to explain the crisis as an academic, as a person who has been involved in this issue in this country or on this issue for the last 15 to 20 years, what I see, there are structural fault lines which exist between Russia and the West. And the dichotomy, I'll explain you in the slides to come, that Russia always wanted to become one of the normal countries of the West, but unfortunately the West never accepted Russia as a part of the West. In 1990s, if you see the policies of Yeltsin, the previous president, he wanted Russia to become a normal Western country. He wanted to establish democracy, but ultimately, probably the West failed to accommodate Russian interest in the West, and Russia started feeling very, very humiliated. And as a consequence, what you see that they have reached a point where there seems to be no silver lining. Russia-West dichotomy is one of the fault lines which has defined Ukraine, Russia, and the Western relationship for a very, very long time. Also, what I see that there is a security dilemma, and security dilemma means not just the security threat, but also how you perceive the threat. And what I see that both Western countries, the way they fear about Russia and the way Russia fears the Western country, so that has created a security dilemma. And if you have this dilemma, no matter how strong you make your security, the dilemma is going to exist. And it leads to arms race and this rearmament, more budgets for military and security, militarization of the country also. So all of that is happening not only in Russia but also in the Western country for the last few years. This crisis in Ukraine is also an outcome of the core, the clash of identity. The clash of identity, you have Ukrainian identity, you have Russian identity, you have cross-cutting identity in Ukraine as well as in Russia and also in the Eastern European countries. But the core identity which defines both Russia and Ukraine, they identify themselves with the Slavic identity and Orthodox Christianity. I'll come to that later. But also competitive nationalism that you see in Russia on the one hand, but also in Ukraine you have several nationalisms, not just Ukrainian nationalism, but also that is countered by the Polish nationalism, or for instance the Russian nationalism, a Russian who live in the eastern part of Ukraine. And I'll show you in a map very quickly. A regime change policy attempted by the West and now being attempted by Russia, President Putin. So that also has created the present crisis. Unfortunately, the one at a larger level, at a larger geopolitical level, at the systemic level, a global system, US has not been able to accept the rise of the powers in the regions, whether it's Eurasia, where Russia is the most important power, or China, which is the most important power in East Asia. For that matter, India also. India is almost a regional power, is a hegemon in South Asia, and Brazil in Latin America. So there are several regional powers which have emerged in the last 20, 30 years, but US is finding it difficult to accept that that is hegemony is not having that kind of influence the way it had in the 1990s, and also the first decade of this century, where they could attack Iraq, they could attack Syria, Libya, Yugoslavia. So all that is not happening now. The US has practically withdrawn from a large part of Asia. US is now US will find it very difficult to operate in Eurasia. It will find difficult to operate in Africa also, because the way China, India, and other countries are entering into Africa and also in Latin America. So US influence is declining, but US is not able to come to terms with multipolar kind of world which is emerging. US remains the most important part. There is absolutely no second thought about it. But US has to accept that there are other regional powers which have emerged, and US must accept it. So those are the structural issues at the systemic level, at the global geopolitical level. But also there are a few precipitating causes, what you call immediate factors, immediate causes of this conflict. And the most important, of course, in my view, is the NATO expansion and the proxy war which was going on in Ukraine for the last 10, 15 years. And after 2014, it was a proxy war between NATO and Russia in different territories of Ukraine. So that is one of the most important reasons. And also, I believe that somehow President Putin also his kind of hubris, you call it, or a kind of miscalculation, where he probably thought that he can easily redraw the map of Ukraine or Europe, or what he calls Russian security. So he probably expected that he'll do a blitzkrieg kind of a strike, immediately go there in the next in a week or so. He'll capture Kyiv and come back. Unfortunately, that has not happened, and the crisis might linger for several weeks and maybe months also. We don't know. Biden administration also wanted to escalate the crisis initially, and to a certain extent. There are 2-3 reasons why Biden administration wanted to escalate. First, because NATO during the previous administration, which was Trump administration, was in disarray. French President Macron said that NATO is a dying institution, and many of the people started believing in that. And France, Turkey, Germany, all these countries started thinking of European security, which would be different from the NATO provided security, and they started having relationship with Russia. And United States got really scared about this kind of development. In fact, if you see the American policies in Europe, it's not just to contain Russia. European policy in American policy in Europe are twofold. One is to contain Russia, but second is also to keep Germany down. US would never like Germany to become a very powerful independent military state. So to contain Germany also, NATO has to be the powerful institution. Only that way United States can keep a control on European security architecture. So that is one of the reasons. And there are some economic reasons. Nord Stream 2 pipeline, I'll show you the map in a second in the slides to come. But that is also one reason, because with the Nord Stream 2 gas pipeline directly from Russia to Germany, Russia could have bypassed Belarus and Ukraine, the two countries through which the traditional pipelines of Russia pass and connect Russia with European countries. And as you know, European countries are largely dependent on oil and gas supplies from Russia. 30 to 35% average, but some of the countries have 80%, 90%. Germany has roughly 40% of gas coming from Russia. And of course, the opportune time was provided by the withdrawal of NATO army from Afghanistan, because Russia thought probably that this is the right time to intervene, because US will never send its troops on the ground, and if it doesn't send its troop on the ground, there's no way Russia can come under pressure of NATO. So these are the broader regions, structural factors, and the immediate causes of the crisis. Now, how do you make sense of Russia? And I love saying this statement. I love giving this statement in my all presentations. But in fact, the Winston Churchill in 1939, he made a remark just before the World War II, that if you want to understand Russia, Russia, according to him, is a riddle wrapped in a mystery inside an enigma. So it's very, very difficult. There are so many layers of Russian security, or the way Russians think about the West. So it's very difficult to make sense of what Russia is actually planning. But he also said that the key to understand Russia is national interest. So if you want to make sense of Russia, you have to understand what is the security and the national interest of Russia. But also the problem is that national interest will not be that helpful, because it's not a static concept. It keeps evolving. And Putin himself, if you see last just 1 month, so Putin's goalpost has shifted. Initially he wanted some kind of autonomy for Donbass. Now he wants a recognition as an independent state, and now Russian army is in Kiev. So you don't really know that that what is the national interest, and so that keeps evolving, that keeps changing. So national interest is a very ambiguous concept for any country, and it's always a changing concept. But what we need to understand historically is the Russian identity. And Russian identity is a split among Westernizers, the people in Russia who want Russia to become a part of the West, and Slavophile, because Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, all of them identify themselves as Slavic countries, apart from Serbia, and there are other countries also in Europe. But these are the core countries which identify themselves as Slavic states. So some of the people identify in Russia even today with that core traditional historic identity of Slavic identity. But Putin, because the Russia never was accepted in the historical period or even today as part of the West. So Russia also started thinking of a distinct identity, which is Eurasian identity. So Eurasian means it's not the part of the West, it's not the part of Europe, and it's not the part of Asia. So it's an Eurasian identity, which gives a distinct identity, but it's used more like an instrument that which can be argued that Russia is a part of the East, depending on if it wants to have an alliance with China. So it will argue that Russia is a part of the East. If it wants to have an alliance with Germany, so it can argue that it's a part of the West. So Eurasian identity is a very fuzzy identity, but it is used as an instrument by President Putin and a number of other scholars in Russia. Now, historically, the three elements which have defined Russia as a nation, if somebody asks you what is the basis of Russian identity, so normally you'll find that a lot of people, Henry Kissinger and a lot of other people have argued that Russian identity or the basis of Russian identity can be identified as orthodoxy. Orthodoxy doesn't mean orthodox as a term. It refers to Orthodox Christianity. So, because I'll come to that in a minute. So, Orthodox Christianity defines the Russian, and this Orthodox Christianity in Russia is different from the Catholic identity that you have in either the eastern part of Europe or the Protestant which you have in the western part of Europe. So, Russians identify themselves as distinct and different, and that Orthodox Christianity. And autocracy or authoritarianism, that has been defining feature of Russia in the Tsarist period. Even during the Soviet period, as you know, the kind of policies that Stalin pursued, so he was very autocratic, or he was very authoritarian, or dictatorial, whatever you want to call it. So autocracy is another feature which defines Russian identity. And of course, because Tsarist identity survived for 500 years, continuous regime of Tsar. So nationalism has remained an important aspect of Russian identity. And even during the Soviet Union, which talked of socialism or international socialism, etc. But even then, the way they kind of created the republics, the 15 republics, they were based on some kind of linguistic nationalism. So nationalism has remained a defining feature, and what President Putin is following today, he is following the hyper nationalism, where he wants to secure Russia forever. Although that never happens, but that's what his plan is. territorially, one of the reasons why military has remained a very strong element in Russian politics and in Russian society, because Russian geography is very, very vulnerable. Russia is surrounded on the one side by China, and Russia had traditionally war with China. It had war with Japan also, and it was defeated also. On the one side, on the southern side, traditionally Russia used to have the Iranian of the Persian Empire, very powerful empire, the British Empire in India, and also Ottoman Empire, which remained till World War One. And on the western side, it has a very powerful, force of the Western European country, right from Hitler, before that Napoleon, etc. So Russia always feels very vulnerable. Russia's population is very low, but it has to, and it mostly, most of the areas are landlocked. So Russia needs a very strong army, and Russia needs strong buffer states to protect its territory. Otherwise, there is a fear. There is a fear that these countries might encroach into the territories of Russia. So Russia feels very, very vulnerable, and militarization, as a consequence, it has always remained one of the important features of Russia. If I have to tell you the kind of complex relationship that Russia has with the West, the dichotomy that I referred to in the beginning. So I'm quoting here Isaiah Berlin, the famous political philosopher. He says that on the one hand, he says that how Russia thinks of the West. So on the one hand, there is an intellectual respect, envy, admiration, and desire to emulate and excel. And on the other hand, emotional hostility, suspicion, and contempt, a sense of clumsy detrop or being outsider, leading as a result to an alteration between excessive self-prostration before and aggressive flouting of Western values. So, this also actually, in a way, defines the way India has its relationship with the West, because we also envy, admire, and have desire to emulate the Western ideas and technology, but also we think that West is degenerated. The Western values cannot be applied to the Indian context. So similarly, Russia also has that kind of contradiction when it comes to understanding the value system there. In the last, very briefly, the three broad phases, the way Russian foreign policy has evolved. So the first phase, 1991 to 95, when Yeltsin was the president of Russia, and just after the disintegration of the Soviet Union. So Yeltsin followed a blind pro-Western policy. And he wanted, as I told you, that he in Russia became a member of IMF, World Bank, etc. And Russia wanted to emulate West. Russia wanted to become a normal Western country. So that was the policy which was followed by Yeltsin. But unfortunately, it led to massive economic crisis. And Russia was humiliated by the Western countries. Most of the economic policies and the entire policy of privatization was controlled by the Western economists from Harvard, Jeffrey Sachs, etc. They were the ones who were controlling the policy of Russia in that time. So that period later on today, if you talk to experts or people there, so they consider that period to be a period of humiliation. And there was a massive unemployment. A ruble crashed. The value of ruble, which was earlier almost equivalent to dollar earlier, so that crashed immediately, and people had to undergo a lot of suffering during that period. And most of the people they reject that period, partly because that was a period of crisis, chaos, and a lot of privatization. And that was a period most of the oligarchs that you see, because most of the socialist control and state control industries, they were sold to the private people, and private people didn't have money. So just imagine how people who had no money, no private property, suddenly they started buying industries, started buying this state industries, and that period led to the emergence of a lot of oligarchs. Unfortunately, the West considers that period to be the best period of democracy. But if you talk to Russian, and also as an independent expert, I can tell you, so that was the worst period for Russia. And what Putin is doing today is, in a way, he's reacting to that kind of policy which was pursued in that period from 1991 to 95. Yeltsin was from the period 1991 till 99, and after that, Putin comes into picture. And Putin was the person, president, who was chosen first as a prime minister. He was chosen by Yeltsin. So the next phase is Eurasianism and search for multipolarity. Russia started realizing that the West, the kind of expectations that it had from the West, investment, technology, that NATO will not expand, that NATO will not deploy its army near the border of Russia, none of that happened, and they started feeling humiliated. And Russia began to be treated as a third-rate power. And people in the United States started saying that Russia is nothing but a petro gas station. Petrol pump. So it supplies gas to the country. Beyond that, Russia is not. So that kind of argument started coming from the Western countries, and they started ignoring the interest of Russia, despite a lot of protest from Russian politicians. So that was the period of Eurasianism and search for multipolarity. And that is the period when Russia, India, RIC, you might have heard of the RIC, and also that has started emerging during that period. Also, BRICS comes later in 2009, 2006 to 2009 period. So that was the period when Russia started searching for some kind of multipolarity, where the West was not considered the prime target of its foreign policy, but the other countries were taken to consider. China became the most important pivot of that multipolarity and the Eurasianism. Crossing the Rubicon, the third phase began after the Munich conference, Munich Security Conference, where President Putin he kind of dropped all his guards, and he blamed the United States for crisis in Europe, the security problems that Russia had with Europe. So 2007 afterwards, I used the phrase crossing the Rubicon, where Russia started intervening directly and indirectly into other countries. First, it started in Georgia. And after that, it intervened in Crimea, then Syria in 2015, 16, and then what you see in Ukraine today. So that is the period of crossing the Rubicon and assertiveness of Russian foreign policy in international politics. Here, I would like you to see the map here. On the eastern side of the map, what you see, the red one and the pink one. So these are the areas where Russian population, Russian-speaking population, who identify themselves as Russian, so they are very, very powerful. They are very dominant in terms of number, in terms of per capita income also, and these are the areas which are industrialized also. Most of the industries of Ukraine are located in this area, and these industries, as you know, they were established by the Soviet Union. So, and as a consequence, because a lot of people started working in the industry, so a lot of people migrated from Russia to this part of Ukraine, and even today, this part has a majority of Russian population. On the blue side that you have, that where Kiev is located, Kiev, so that is where Ukrainian speaking population. But Ukrainian identity is also very, very complex, because you have people, most of the people, 70-80% people, they understand Russian language, because the origin of Ukrainian Russian language has been very from the same root, so they understand the language. And the Orthodox Christianity is another thing which is common in both the areas. And Russia as a state that has emerged not from Moscow, not from St. Petersburg, and I'll tell you how it has emerged from Kiev. Kiev was the center of the origin of Russian identity. Here, just to give you a background that how Ukraine as a state was created by when different parts of Ukraine, were added by different rulers. As you can see in 1654, a small, very small territory, the orange color that you see in the middle. So that was just the territory of Ukraine in 1654. Then major part was added between 1654 to 97 by different Tsarist rulers, and the yellow part that you see, they were added in that period. In 1939 to 45, after the World War II, what you call Lviv, where most of the refugees are today, and that is the area which connects Ukraine to Poland, Romania, etc. So that area was again this Stalin. And then 1922, earlier, the blue area that you see, that was added by Vladimir Lenin, the first ruler of Russia. Nikita Khrushchev, the famous ruler of the Soviet Union. So he also, the Crimea initially was not part of Ukraine. Crimea was always a part of Russia. But in the Soviet Union, it was just an administrative change. So Nikita Khrushchev in 1954 took away that small territory from the Republic of Russia, and it added to Ukraine. So, and that is why Russian claim that that Crimea has always been part of Russia, and it was a historical mistake committed by the Soviet rulers. And if you see the image here, this is the guy called Varangan Rurik, and 1862 AD, and this Kievan Rus, it was established by this person, this Rurik, and he is the founder of what you call Russia today. So the Russian state didn't emerge in Moscow or St. Petersburg. The Russian state actually emerged in Kiev. Kiev is the capital of Ukraine. So it ruled for 300-400 years, but because of the nature of politics there, it was always claimed by different powers, especially Lithuanian Empire, the Polish Empire, the Ottoman Empire, Austro-Hungarian, and also Russian. So Ukraine has always traditionally been part which has been contested by different historical dynasties and empires. Kievan Rus was incorporated into Grand Duchy of Lithuania and eventually into the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth in 1569. Russia grew its influence in Ukraine after 1654, and there was a famous agreement between the Ukrainian ruler and the Russian ruler, which is known as Pereslav Agreement, 1654. Remember this date, 1654, because exactly after 300 years, Khrushchev transferred that Crimea from Russia to Ukraine to celebrate that 300 years. So the Russian thought that that was a historical mistake, and Russia kind of annexed it in 2014. And so what I'm trying to say here is that Ukrainian identity is a very complex, multicultural kind of identity, and it has traditionally, historically been a part of different empires in different periods. But by and large, the majority of the territory of Ukraine has remained with Russia historically, and Ukrainians are often referred to as Little Russian by the Russian people. And as I told you, that Orthodox Christianity is one of the defining features of Russian identity, but also Ukrainian identity. Most of the people in Ukraine, they identify themselves with Orthodox Christianity, and later on you can ask me questions on Orthodox Christianity. But for the time being, remember that Ukraine also as a term means borderland. Borderland of what? Borderland, that means western borderland of Russian Empire. So Ukraine as a term is also the borderland of Russian Empire. So these are the reasons why Russia actually claims historically that Ukraine has always been a part of Russian Empire, and Ukraine, Russia is willing to accept the sovereignty of Ukraine, but Russia is not willing to accept that Ukraine become a part of NATO, or Ukraine is used by NATO to contain Russia. So that's all the conflict is all about from the Russian perspective. Russia, yeah. So this is the historical part. So I'm not getting into this now. The genesis of the crisis, 2014. So that has started in 2013 when Yanukovych was the leader, and he signed an agreement with European Union for the Eastern Partnership Agreement. That's what it is called. So Eastern Economic Partnership Agreement was a kind of agreement which could have taken place between Ukraine and European Union. And European Union claimed that Ukraine is as a sovereign state. It can decide its fate, it can decide its sovereignty, and it should not come under any pressure. Russia offered a better deal. Russia offered $15 billion of loan. Russia also put pressure, of course, politically on Yanukovych to not sign that deal, and instead that Ukraine should become a part of Eurasian Economic Union. Eurasian Economic Union, you have Russia, Kazakhstan, other countries also. So Russia wanted Ukraine to become a part of Eurasian Union and not the European Union. So so Yanukovych decided finally not to sign agreement with European Union, and as a consequence there was a protest, and that protest, what happened in Euromaidan, is called Euromaidan protest in Ukraine. So that protest was widely supported by civil societies, which were being funded by European countries, which were also being funded by some of the American by America and other states. So that became a very controversial kind of protest, and after that Yanukovych had to flee. He had to flee from Ukraine to Russia, and that is considered the genesis of the crisis. And after that, Russia decided to annex Crimea. And the term used is not annex. Russia said it reincorporated Crimea, because Crimea, according to them, was always a part of Russian Empire. And as you can see in the figure here, Russia was ruled by a famous ruler called Catherine the Great, and she is the one who actually captured Crimea from the Ottoman Empire. Ottoman was the Turkish Empire, and Ottoman Empire was a very powerful empire which survived for several hundred years until the First World War. So Catherine the Great, she captured that Crimea region from Ottoman Empire. Russia lost the Crimea War in 1850s later. Subsequently, it became a part of the Soviet Russia in 1921 as an autonomous socialist republic. In 1954, I've told you the history. One of the claims which is made Russia is on the southern part of Ukraine, which it calls Novorussia. And Novorussia, why that Novorussia? Because the reason that region of Ukraine was primarily captured by the Russian ruler. And the Russian population, you'll find in that region, more in that region. So that region, Russia claims to be traditionally part of the Russian Empire and the Russian system. So from Moscow's perspective, this annexation of Crimea was presented as a correction of historical mistake. and that's how they kind of argue it. Vladimir Putin, the president of Russia, he wrote an article which is available on the net, and that gives a good perspective of how Russia thinks of Ukraine today. Everything is fine. He claims that Russia and Ukraine had a common origin. Russia and Ukraine, they follow the common Orthodox faith. Saint Vladimir was the person who actually brought Christianity. So it's the same person, revered by Ukrainian and also by Russian. So he was the prince of both Kiev and Novgorod. So because of those reasons, Russia finds it difficult that Ukraine, which has traditionally been part of Russia, now becoming the part of the West. So that becomes very, very difficult for Russian leaders to accept that. So he wrote in that article, and you may not agree with that, because he said that true sovereignty of Ukraine is possible only in partnership with Russia. And he also said that because Donbas region, etc., was not being given the autonomy which was promised by the Minsk II agreement, which was happening between Ukraine, Russia, Germany, and France. So because of that, Putin probably Putin thinks that Donbas region, which is Russian dominated, so they should have been given the autonomy, but that was not given, and that has created a kind of crisis in between Ukraine and Russia. One of the things that you need to know, because that's being discussed all the time, is the NATO expansion. If you see the Cold War period from 1951 to 1991, there were 3-4 countries which became part of NATO. But if you see the post-Cold War period, after the disintegration of the Soviet Union, NATO expanded. It was a big bang expansion of NATO. And NATO in 2000, as you can see in the figure, in 1999, Czechoslovakia and Hungary became the member. In 2004, Slovakia, then Bulgaria, Romania, then Slovenia, and the Baltic state, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania. So all these states, many of the states, like Baltic states, they were part of the Soviet Union. Then they were republics. Then they became independent nations. So they were included in NATO. So Russia started thinking that the kind of promise which was made by the West, so that has never been followed or pursued by the West. The West never agreed to that agreement which was made in 1994. There were different agreements, Budapest, Bucharest, etc. So West, according to from Moscow's perspective, West did not follow the commitment that it made to Russia. So it has started expanding, and now it wants to include Ukraine and Georgia, the two republics which are left: Georgia, Ukraine, and Moldova. They are the three ones which are left on that side, and NATO wants to include all these three states. And as a consequence, Russia is feeling very, very threatened because of NATO expansion. The pipeline that you need to know, this is very important aspect of this conflict. On the top of it that you see, this one, which the top line, which is maroon and red kind of line, which connects St. Petersburg with Germany. So what Russia and Germany did, that because Ukraine was in a crisis for the last 10 years, so Russia and Germany decided that instead of having a pipeline through Ukraine or through Belarus, which were the traditional pipelines, Russia decided that it will have a direct pipeline from St. Petersburg going through the Baltic Sea, as you can see, to Germany. And it could have connected not just to Germany, but also to other countries. So Germany, so that became a real threat. United States started thinking, and many other European countries also started thinking, that if that happens, Germany will become completely dependent on supply of gas from Russia. And even though even today Russia supplies nearly 30 to 35% of the gas to Germany, but dependence would have increased had this pipeline succeeded. And this pipeline was about to be completed. And also because, as I told you, that United States wanted, the Biden administration had lost its credibility in Afghanistan, so it wanted to revive its foreign policy instrument, NATO, and it wanted to give a rationale and justification to NATO, and it thought that that if there is some escalation of the conflict, so probably NATO can get a new justification and new rationale. So those were the plans which actually US pursued in the last few months. So the US did not want Germany to develop this pipeline also, Nord Stream 2 pipeline. And also because many of the scholars feel that now with the Shell Energy and US wants to supply gas directly to European countries. So if Russia does not supply, the benefit, the two countries which will get the maximum benefit, one is of course United States, and also the second comes China. So United States also thought in terms of economic benefit by escalating a little bit of crisis. Of course, I don't think United States wants to go for a world war kind of want to create a world war kind of situation, but some kind of escalation is beneficial for United States because of NATO and because of the pipeline. Now this pipeline has been cancelled. Let me tell you. So. Uh, what were Russia's demand from the West? There were three primary demands. One was that NATO will not expand, Ukraine will not be included. That was number one. The second one, Russia demanded that the missiles which have been installed in Poland, Romania, etc., by NATO, so those missiles will be withdrawn. Because that threatens the security of Russia. So that was second demand. The third was that NATO will remove its troops from you know from Poland, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, etc., the bordering states. So those were three demands put forward by Russia before NATO, just before the crisis started. Unfortunately, and let me tell you that Russia would have agreed for just if the NATO had agreed that Ukraine will not become the member of NATO. So even with one demand, probably if that West had acceded to the demand, Russia would have been satisfied. But the West was finding it difficult to accept, and especially after the debacle in Afghanistan, United States and Biden administration would never have accepted that demand. So as a consequence, what you see is the crisis escalated and this conflict started. Now, finally, I'll take just 2-3 minutes and I'll finish my presentation here. So what is Putin's grand strategy? If you follow the Western media, or if you follow CNN, or if you follow Western, the BBC and other media, there are three primary hypotheses. मतलब तीन प्लान है रशिया के उनके हिसाब से, मतलब जो हम सोच पा रहे हैं, तो तीन हाइपोथेसिस है। एक तो यह है कि कुछ लोगों का मानना है कि रूस जो है वो एक तरह से यूएसएसआर जो सोवियत यूनियन था उसको रिक्रिएट करने की कोशिश कर रहा है। दूसरा, कुछ लोग यह भी बोलते हैं कि रूस यूएसएसआर को क्रिएट करने की कोशिश नहीं कर रहा है, रूस जारिस्ट रशिया जो कि 1917 से पहले का रशिया था उसको क्रिएट करने, यानी जारिस्ट रशिया को, ही इज अ जार एंड ही इज ट्राइंग टू क्रिएट अ काइंड ऑफ दैट काइंड ऑफ रशिया, जारिस्ट रशिया। तो ये एक हाइपोथेसिस है जो कि काफी पॉपुलर है वेस्टर्न कंट्रीज, वेस्टर्न लिटरेचर अगर आप देखेंगे तो आपको लगेगा कि ऐसा ही हो रहा है। लेकिन मेरे हिसाब से जो ज्यादा उचित लगता है और जो मेरे हिसाब से लगता है कि रशिया करने की कोशिश कर रहा है, तो वो अपनी सिक्योरिटी जो है वो वहां पे रीस्टैब्लिश करने की कोशिश कर रहा है उन सारे स्लाविक कंट्रीज में जिसकी मैंने बात की, जिसमें कि यूक्रेन आता है, बेलारूस आता है और फिर उसमें रूस आता है। ये तीन जो कोर स्लाविक स्टेट हैं वहां पे वो वेस्टर्न इंटरफेरेंस नहीं चाहता है। और मुझे लगता है कि कीव की जो घेराबंदी की जा रही है उसका एक मुख्य मकसद यह है कि वो रूस वहां पे चाहता है कि वहां पे जो रेजिम हो या जो भी वहां पे दूसरा गवर्नमेंट बने, मतलब इसको तो टॉपल करना चाहता है, इसको वहां पे दूसरा गवर्नमेंट लाने की कोशिश जरूर करेगा, क्योंकि अगर जेलेंस्की इसकी बात को नहीं मानते हैं कि परमानेंटली नाटो मेंबर नहीं बनेगा तो रूस वापस नहीं आने वाला है मेरे हिसाब से। और रूस को लगता है कि उसको एक तरह से बफर स्टेट के रूप में यूज कर सकता है या फिर वहां पे अपनी आर्मी को लंबे टाइम तक भी रख सकता है। तो ये कहना अभी मुश्किल है कि उसकी क्या एग्जैक्ट स्ट्रेटजी है। लेकिन हाँ, अभी का रेजिम जो है, चूंकि जेलेंस्की बोल रहे हैं कि उनको काफी सपोर्ट है नाटो को, वो बोल रहे हैं कि उनको लोगों का सपोर्ट है, तो मुझे लगता है कि उस वैसी स्थिति में वहां पे कन्फ्लिक्ट अभी लंबे चलने की संभावना है। और जो एक तीसरी जो हाइपोथेसिस है जो कि रूस में बहुत पॉपुलर है, रूस में लोगों का मानना है कि क्यों आखिर ऐसा कर रहा है। तो वेस्टर्न वाले तो मैंने बताया कि उनका मानना है कि यूएसएसआर क्रिएट कर रहा है या जारिस्ट रशिया। जो मोर रैशनल है कि मुझे लगता है कि वो रेजिम चेंज करने की कोशिश करेंगे और अपने फेवरेबल गवर्नमेंट वहां पे बिठाने की कोशिश करेंगे जो 2014 जैसे कि यानुकोविच के टाइम पे था। और तीसरी बात जो कि रशिया में पॉपुलर है, जैसे मैंने बताया कि वो मानते हैं, रूसी लोग ज्यादातर मानते हैं कि नाटो को रोकना जरूरी है और नाटो को रोकने के लिए इन्वेजन भी जरूरी है। और यहाँ तक कि जो ऑर्थोडॉक्स क्रिश्चियनिटी के जो हेड होते हैं मॉस्को में, जो पेट्रियार्क बोलते हैं उसको, वो उनका नाम किरिल है। किरिल ने भी बोला है कि वहां पे कि ये जो इन्वेजन है वो जस्टिफाइड है। तो इस ढंग का जो पॉपुलर सेंटिमेंट है वो उसको सपोर्ट करता है। जो सर्वेज है रूस में, वहां पे 70% लोग लगभग वहां पे इस जो इन्वेजन है उसको सपोर्ट करते हैं। यूक्रेनियन सॉवरेंटी यहाँ पे एक तरह से बलि का बकरा बन गया है। और उनकी जो एक डेवलपमेंट का प्रोसेस चल रहा था या जो उनका जो एक सॉवरेन स्टेटस था, अभी के टाइम में मुझे नहीं लगता है कि वो रह पाएगा, क्योंकि या तो वो रशिया के दबाव में रहेंगे जिसकी संभावना ज्यादा है, और अगर रशिया वहां से विड्रॉ भी करता है तो फिर वो या तो न्यूट्रल पॉलिसी रखेंगे, क्योंकि न्यूट्रल जब तक नहीं रखेंगे तब तक रूस नहीं मानेगा, और नहीं तो फिर अगर नाटो का प्रभाव बढ़ता है फ्यूचर में तो फिर नाटो के इन्फ्लुएंस में रहेगा। तो सबसे जो खतरनाक बात है कि सबसे जो दुखद बात है कि वहाँ के जो बिल्कुल इनोसेंट जो सिटीजन्स हैं, सिविलियंस हैं, वो काफ़ी सफ़र कर रहे हैं। उनको लगभग 25 लाख लोग वहाँ से बाहर जा चुके हैं, वो रिफ्यूजी का स्टेटस है। लकीली यूरोप ने तो रिफ्यूजी को लिया है, लेकिन कब तक रखेगा और वहाँ पे किस ढंग का क्राइसिस होता है, ये बहुत ही मुश्किल होने वाला है। तो वहाँ पे फाइनली मैं इंडिया का पोज़ीशन 1 मिनट में बता दूँगा, उसके बाद मैं खत्म करता हूँ कि इंडिया की पॉलिसी आप जानते हैं कि इंडिया हैज़ ट्राइड टू मेंटेन अ न्यूट्रल काइंड ऑफ पॉलिसी। इंडिया ने एब्सटेन किया है यूनाइटेड नेशन सिक्योरिटी काउंसिल में या एटॉमिक एनर्जी में की जो मीटिंग हुई थी, या दूसरे जगह पे जनरल असेंबली की जो यूनाइटेड नेशन में मीटिंग हुई थी, सारे जगहों पे इंडिया ने एक तरह से ये रशिया को कंडेम नहीं किया है। इंडिया के जो वर्डिंग्स भी हैं उसमें इन्वेजन वर्ड आक्रमण यूज नहीं हुआ है। तो इंडिया बहुत ही केयरफुली प्ले कर रहा है, क्योंकि आप जानते हैं कि इंडिया तीनों देश जो इन्वॉल्व हैं, यानी 4 एक्टर्स जो इन्वॉल्व हैं, यूनाइटेड स्टेट्स का भी फ्रेंड है इंडिया, यूरोपियन कंट्री से हमारे अच्छे रिलेशन है, यूक्रेन से भी फॉर्चुनेटली हमारे अच्छे रिलेशन है, और रशिया के साथ हमारा हिस्टोरिक डिफेंस और बहुत सारे स्ट्रॉन्ग टाइज हैं। तो इन कारणों से इंडिया हैज मेंटेन्ड अ वेरी बैलेंस्ड काइंड ऑफ पॉलिसी, एंड इन माय व्यू इट इज अ वेरी जस्टिफाइड पोजीशन। India has done reasonably well in terms of having a balanced policy in maintaining its ties also with Ukraine, apart from United States and Russia. So our defense purchase, as you know, that it comes even today 60 to 70% it comes from Russia, and we cannot ignore that. And Russia plays very important role in Afghanistan, Iran, Central Asia, on the issue of border conflict with China, etc. So we have to be very very careful, because our core interests are also continental. इंडिया के जो हम कॉन्टिनेंटल पावर, हमारे कॉन्फ्लिक्ट जो ज्यादातर अभी होते हैं वो चीन के साथ और पाकिस्तान के साथ होते हैं। अगर रूस उन देशों को सपोर्ट करना ओपनली शुरू कर दिया तो भारत की मुसीबतें बढ़ जाएंगी। और दूसरी मजबूरी यह है कि जो चाइना के साथ जो मैरीटाइम सिक्योरिटी एग्रीमेंट है, उसमें हमारा यूएस के साथ बड़ा अच्छा रिलेशन है, क्वाड एग्रीमेंट हमारा। तो इंडिया हैज टू मेंटेन अ बैलेंस्ड policy, and in my view it's a very justified position. So I think I'll stop it here, and I'll be happy to take whatever questions that you might have. So thank you everybody for listening to me, and I hope I didn't exceed my time. I was not keeping a note of time, but thank you so much everybody, and I hope I did a good job. Thank you.
You did a fantastic job, Rajan. Thank you very much. And I'm sure the presentation was very lucid, very brief, very succinct, very to the point, and it actually brought out a lot of questions that people may have had. I think I've lost Rajan. Rajan, I think while sharing your screen, you probably disappeared. I'll request the backend team to bring him back. Please call him and get him back on the stage for us, because he seems to have disappeared from the stage. So we will have to wait. But I will just, while we are requesting Rajan to join back again, some very interesting things have happened, and I will just speak about that a little bit. Just give me a minute so that I can ask him to join back again. Just give me a minute, everyone, because we didn't expect that he will leave us. Yes. So while Rajan is joining us, there's some very interesting, this entire discussion has happened in very interesting circumstances. We've heard Rajan's presentation on what Russia thinks, what the West thinks, and I'm going to ask him to tell us what Ukraine thinks of the West. So we have Rajan. Rajan, you just disappeared, I think, while...
something happened. And yeah.
Absolutely okay. So Rajan, we are very grateful for your presentation, and in your presentation you've actually taken us down through ages of humiliation, right from the feudal empire that we had after 1907, the communist regimes that came into place, how Russia became the Russian Empire, became USSR, and then the Soviet Union disintegrated and became what it is today, and further disintegration. I think that's how the wheel of history moves. But your presentation has focused on the Russian view of the whole situation of Ukraine, and probably the Western view. I would like to begin by asking you, can you also throw some light on how the Ukrainians feel about Russia and how the Ukrainians feel about their strategic location in Europe, in West? How do they see themselves, the current regime, basically? How do the people see it? And what do the Ukrainians want apart from just joining? What is their identity crisis? Speak a little bit about that, please.
Yeah, thank you. That's very, very interesting question, Mugdha. And I feel really, really sorry because, Ukraine as a state, as a nation state, at the moment appears completely divided. When you ask me what Ukrainian thinks, there can be several answers to that, depending on what you consider to be Ukraine today. If you take just the Western Ukrainian side, so most of the people there, and when the political parties that win from that region, the western part of Ukraine, so they want to join NATO. Majority of the people in that region, they want to join NATO. They want to become the part of the European Union if the European Union is willing to give the membership. But unfortunately, neither NATO nor the European Union, they are offering membership to Ukraine. So they are also trying to play a proxy kind of game. Ukraine, the kind of support that Ukraine expected, they probably thought that United States and the NATO countries will give more supplies to Ukraine. So that is also not happening. So, but Ukrainian people, if I say again the second point that, if I talk about the Ukrainian people in the eastern part of Ukraine, where the Donbas region is located. So in that region, in Luhansk and Donetsk, these are the two areas where majority of the people are Russian. So they want to get closer to Russia, and they want to either become independent or be in good books or good terms with Russia. So Ukrainian population as a large is divided, but yes, Putin's invasion, in my view, it has created a kind of a strong reaction towards even the people who are otherwise neutral. Many of the people now in Ukraine think that what Russia is doing, it cannot be justified. It's not a just war. So many of the people who are otherwise, very neutral, they would not have taken the side from either side. So now they do not like the invasion which has come from Russia. And in my view, if you want to fight against NATO, why don't fight against NATO? If at all, if your conflict is with the NATO, Ukraine should not be used either by Russia or by NATO. So Ukraine has become a scapegoat. ये बलि का बकरा बन गया है और यूक्रेन दोनों के बीच में फंस गया है. और मुझे लगता है कि अगर ऑनेस्ट सेंसस होता, एक सर्वे होता, तो मुझे लगता है कि अभी के समय में जो लोग हैं वहाँ पे मेजॉरिटी चाहते हैं कि उनको क्योंकि इन्वेजन से वो दुखी हो चुके हैं, तो उनको लगता है कि हमें नाटो का मेंबर बनना चाहिए. हालांकि ये अलग बात है कि नाटो उनको मेंबर नहीं बनाने जा रहा है और ना ही यूरोपियन यूनियन उनको मेंबर बनाने जा रहा है. सो इट्स वेरी वेरी डिवाइडेड, मुग्धा, ऑन द इश्यू ऑफ where do people stay. But yes, now the state and sovereignty of Ukraine is under crisis. What you see is a balkanization. What you see is more like situation what we saw in Afghanistan, where this proxy war kind of situation might continue even if the regime is toppled. The new regime comes supported by Russia, so it's very likely that NATO will keep supplying arms and weapons and support to the people who would be fighting against that kind of regime. So Ukraine, you are going to witness a very long civil war kind of situation in Ukraine, irrespective of which regime is in power, Zelensky or post-Zelensky. So that's what I see in the next few years.
Yeah. So what you also spoke in your presentation, Rajan, was about identity crises, on both sides. And I think it's imagined fear on both sides that has led to this, because I think the way the West, what is very evident for the lay person probably is not so evident to the people who are at the helm of power. Some time back, when we were in school and college, Francis Fukuyama, Samuel Huntington wrote about the clash of civilizations. Francis Fukuyama has recently written a book on identity, and he talks of the Nietzsche's Last Man and the problem of thymos, which basically says that the soul wants deep recognition. The soul has the craving for deep recognition. Amy Chuha writes about the fact that US, and she mentioned 7 other states countries where US as a democracy was not able to see in the wars that it entered into, Vietnam and Korea and so many other theaters, that its identity, and it's mostly the racial and the ethnic identity which is at the root, which is the basic instinct of man who has this tribal instinct of, gathering. Also the fact that, identity in a way is a double edged sword which has the power to unite and also has the power to exclude. So I think that is also happening in the theater. But my question to you with that background is that we are talking of three ends in this whole thing. NATO, of course, you've spoken about in detail. What about the nuclearization? Do you think Russia would have had the same kind of power if Ukraine had not given up on its nuclear status? That is one question. The other thing that we hear in the news is denazification, with Zelensky being a Jew. Talk about the other two ends, which you've probably not touched. The fate, what is it about the nuclear thing? What is the agenda that is driving people? And what is this whole concept of denazification? Because any which ways, Germany is not supporting the entry of Ukraine into NATO, neither is France, nor is Turkey. Please talk about these other two ends
Thank
in
you.
the theater.
Thank you. 3 points, Mugdha. The first assumption that you made from Samuel Huntington, Clash of Civilization. In fact, what is happening in Ukraine that punctures the theory of Clash of Civilization, because it punctures the theory, because the theory said that the future conflicts would be based on cultural fault lines, and he identified cultural fault lines as Islamic versus Christianity, and Christianity versus Confucianism. So what is happening is internal conflict within Christianity. All right, so it doesn't support that theory at all. But anyway, the important question that you asked was denuclearization, denazification. What does Russia mean by it? Russia, if I have to take the official view of Russia, so what they mean, what they think that the Zelensky's regime is a regime like Nazis, and that because he is getting a lot of support from the Western countries, is hyper nationalism, and he is also oppressive to some extent towards the Russian linguistic minority. So because of all these reasons, Russia says that Russia has to denazify Ukraine. And by demilitarization, he means that it has to kind of cripple the military installations in different parts of Ukraine. But let me tell you that I think that is more like a pretext of war rather than the reality. If Nazis were ruling in Ukraine, I do not think that Germany would be supporting that regime. And also, do not forget that the ruler Zelensky is a Jewish. His grandfathers fought in Soviet army, Red Army, against Hitler. So I do not buy that official argument of Moscow, where they argue that it's a kind of war against Nazi and all. So that is not the case. Yes, it was discriminatory towards Russian population. That's a fact, but it's not a Nazi regime at all. As far as the second question of nuclear Ukraine is considered, whether that could have worked as deterrent, that's a very valid question. And in my view, that definitely would have worked as as a deterrent, because you do not attack a nuclear country because of the threats that you have. All these countries in 1994, the agreement that happened, Budapest Agreement and the other agreements also, Russia and the Western countries both promised that they will ensure the security of Ukraine, and they will also provide some funds and grants also to Ukraine if they decide to kind of get rid of that nuclear weapons. Ukraine did it. But unfortunately, what is happening today, that neither the kind of protection that is expected from NATO, that is not happening, and Russia has invaded Ukraine. So nuclear deterrent, it could have worked. It has not worked, and sanctions cannot be the nuclear deterrent. No matter how much of sanctions you can put in, Iran survived the sanctions, and most of the regimes in the world, they have survived the sanction for several decades. So sanctions, economic, commercial interest, they never worked as nuclear deterrent. But yes, nuclear case would have been different. You are right. Thank you.
So we'll talk about sanctions also, Rajan, because Yogesh has also asked a question on sanctions. But I'll just like you to hold on to that thought a little bit, where we are talking about identity, and it's still not completely done with that question. It is increasingly being believed that democracy with gross inequality is incompatible with universal brotherhood, which basically means that the social fabric gets torn. And we are aware that that in Russia's own economy, only 10% people are very, very rich, and the rest 90% so are very, very poor, are not able to maintain an average lifestyle. And I have had some, personal eyewitness stories of having traveled in Russia some 10 years back, and seen the kind of opulence that exists in a few, and spoken to a few people. So tell me something which is of interest to me, and this is also a universal template, because Putin also himself, extended his tenure as president very recently. So there is some mastermind game planning which already existed in his scheme of things, probably. And I want you to answer that question, because in a democratic setup it becomes very difficult to hold on to things when your economy is nose diving, right? And there are economic interests involved in this whole scheme of things. The universal template, and my question to you is this: that increasingly we are seeing that, be it China, be it countries elsewhere. We had a Trump regime in USA just before Joe Biden's term. We are also seeing it in several other countries around the world. I don't want to mention all countries by name, but we are aware. This increasing, wanting, the craving to glorify the past, to validate the existence of the country. Uh, because you are not very comfortable. This is the land of social media. Russia has been doing this, be it data manipulation, the Steve Bannon case we have seen. So right now, interference in each other's countries is not just military interference; it's also having puppet regimes installed. China has done it in a different manner by investing monies. Russia has done through data manipulation. We have seen Chris Wiley and everybody. So, talk a little bit about this urge to go back to the past, glorification of the ancient past as a veil to cover what is happening, the crisis that is happening in the country itself, unemployment, economic poverty, your own people not very happy with the regime, so you extend your tenure, become president for life, and then you start tinkering with things around. So maybe Joe Biden is doing the same, because he wants to divert attention from what is happening in US. Putin is doing the same because he wants to avert attention from what is happening in his own country. Speak a little about that.
Thank you. This debate is very, very important, and you raised a very good question of glorification, glorifying the past. Our argument goes that Russia is trying to re-establish the glory of the past. Now, in my view, the way I understand Russian history and culture, remember that there is no unanimity, there is no consensus on which past to glorify in Russia, even today. Putin has said that that was a catastrophe. Disintegration of the Soviet Union was a catastrophe, but at the same time, Putin has also been critical of many of the policies of the Soviet Union. So, when you say a glory of the past, are you talking about Gorbachev? Are you talking about Stalin? Are you talking about the ideologically committed Lenin? Are you talking about the Tsar? And Tsars are also of different varieties. Some were just puppets, and some were very weak, and some were like Peter the Great. So, the comparison which is being made by a lot of people, especially coming from the Western media, and so they say that he is trying to create the Tsarism or the Tsarist empire. All right, but my point is, the Tsarist empire also disintegrated. So why do you want to create that kind of system? Putin knows about it. He also, some of the people also argue that he wants to become the Peter the Great, because Peter the Great, who established St. Petersburg, and you have been to St. Petersburg, I know. So he wants to create that kind of system. So I think my view is that Putin is aware of the fact that he cannot create the Tsarist empire. He cannot create even the Soviet Union. Why? Because the world has completely changed, and some of the people, treat President Putin as a crazy person who is going to take all the territories of the post-Soviet state. But in my view, that is not the case. In my view, what he's trying to do, because I told you that there is a security dilemma. And security is an issue of perception. It's not about the real threat and the real security. Real threat and security is a very imaginary kind of concept. It doesn't exist. But if you have the security dilemma, when you fear that NATO is going to contain you, NATO is going to invade you. It might take away the territories which are very productive, the oil field and gas field, etc. So then you try to ensure a boundary which can ensure the security of Russia as a state. So in my view, Russia is concerned primarily about halting the expansion of NATO. Russia is second motive of Russia is to play a bigger role in European security architecture, where it can have a good relation with Germany, France, Italy also. And it would like many of the countries to remain neutral. For instance, not every European Union country is a member of NATO. Austria is a neutral state. Austria is not a member of NATO. Finland is not a member of NATO. Sweden is not a member of NATO. So these are the so Russia would prefer a kind of a role in the broader European security architecture. That's a fact. Russia also wanted to revive its economy, but now for the next 10, 15 years, I think it would be very, very difficult. And by the time it establishes a relationship with China, so that will take time. But remember that the reason why Putin cannot revive either Tsarism or Soviet Union, because other powers have become important. The world has become multipolar. World is not bipolar, remember. And world is not the monarchies of the Tsarist period. So China has become important. Do you think China will allow Russia to have influence in Southeast Asia or on Korea? It's very, very difficult. India will not allow in South Asia. Brazil will not allow in Latin America, and then Africa is again divided. So what I think in Africa, out of 34 countries or something, 40 odd countries, 17 countries voted or abstained in favor of Russia. So the world is very divided, and I do not think Putin is so foolish that he can think of reviving either the Soviet Union or the Tsarist Empire. Coming to your question of inequality and democracy, remember that the narrative is important. Russian media is very, very controlled by the state, especially the electronic media. So the narrative that people are getting is very, very different from the narrative that we get in India from the West. And other places. So it's a totally different, and narrative is controlled by the state. In all the authoritarian state, the narrative is always controlled by the state, and that's exactly the case in Russia also. And per capita income and inequality, I think that is not linked to democracy. There is a theory that you have to have minimum per capita income to have democracy. I don't think India was a developing country in the 40s, 50s, 60s, but still we remain democracy. Inequality is there. You are absolutely right. And oligarch, as I told you, that they became very powerful, and only those oligarchs survived, which got the patronage of Putin. So many of them, like Khodorkovsky and all, who were the head of Yukos Oil, famous oil, so he has been jailed also. And people were very unhappy because of these oligarchs. And unfortunately, these oligarchs get support from the Western states, and they think that these are the people who can lead some kind of socialist, some kind of civil society change in Russia. So I think I'll stop it here. Yeah, you can ask me the next one.
So my question about inequality was that if inequality exists in democracy, it becomes very difficult to hold the social fiber together, and you are bound to have dissensions. It was not whether with inequality you can't have democracy. So just a correction on my observation. But talking of the primordial need, I somehow feel, and of course I would want to be stand corrected by the expert, but I feel that sometimes the unpredictability born out of fear, a very psychological thing I'm talking of right now, and we know Russia has played psychological warfare earlier also. So what looks as unpredictability to me could also look as a strategic, dimension to the world, is what I'm trying to say. But my question is that, when we look at Europe, from Europe's perspective, we have seen that this whole, experiment that Europe tried with the European Union, 2015 onwards, the fabric has been kind of, disintegrating in many ways. The way that it was assumed has not worked. We had a Brexit very recently, and we've now seen that the Eastern Europe is actually, disintegrating, has come together, gone back. And this is also a template of history. So it is nothing new that is happening in contemporary times. Europe has seen that many times over, beginning from the Vikings and down to the Roman Catholic Habsburg Empire, the Moors on the western side. So all this has been happening of late. But my question is that, culturally, the Russia that I have known as a child was through the propaganda that happened, through the books that we read in the market. Right. And we have seen, we did a presentation on China recently, and we see how China is using social media, culture, setting up the Confucius Institutes, using culture to improve its image in the Western, in the Western market. Trying to, intellectually find a strategic footing. With war, I don't know whether that aim can be fulfilled, but talk a little about what the mastermind, master stroke with regard to culture is, which we know very little, because culture is a very, very important tool of kind to trying to set your reputation right in the Western market, obtaining leadership, obtaining support. What is Russia doing? Is Russia doing anything with respect to that, apart from the war that it is led to recently? Talk a little about the cultural influences, and as an instrument of reimagining Russia. And also, when I spoke of the past, it's like the Benedict Anderson's past, imagined past. You can imagine. So there is everything for everybody. If you are a believer in the Tsarist, you can think that, okay, it's the Tsarist revival which is happening. If you are a person which holds the communist thing, so it's like keeping it vague, but keep referring to the past.
Yeah, thank you, Mugdha. Imagining is fine, but imagining has to stand on the reality. Otherwise, imagination becomes just a dream. So, Manu, coming to the point of cultural war, cultural context, let me tell you that every nation state would defines according to some kind of cultural exceptionalism. In the case of Russia, that cultural exceptionalism is, of course, the language. But also the Orthodox Christianity. At least Putin, President Putin, he does define Russian identity in terms of this Orthodox Christianity. And Orthodox Christianity, as as you know, that there are three heads, patriarchs. One is the Vatican patriarch, that Pope Francis that you have. The second one is the ecumenical, which is located in that Istanbul, which was part of Constantinople, and the third one is the Moscow Patriarch. Moscow Patriarch, and the head of the Moscow Patriarch is Kirill, is the name at the moment. So he, in fact, is very interesting. I'll share the article with you, which what I read in New Yorker. What he says is very interesting. He says that this invasion is justified because we cannot allow the gays to parade the way they do it in the West. All right. So they fear that the gay, lesbian, etc. So they fear that the West is degenerated, and if the Western influence comes to Russia or Ukraine, those kind of values will come, and this Orthodox Christianity will get compromised. Some of the things that we hear in India also, and many other developing countries. So coming back to Kirill, that patriarch, Moscow patriarch, he justified this war, and he's the only one out of three patriarchs that I told you, that one in Istanbul, one in Vatican. Vatican has taken the neutrality. The Vatican follows the policy of neutrality. He'll not say anything against this thing. And Vatican is also separated from the Moscow Patriarch. But Moscow Patriarch says that it's a just war, and we need to check the Western influence. So he's not defining as a economic influence or the diplomatic influence over Ukraine. He is defining this war as a cultural war. And because in the after the disintegration of the Soviet Union, that Orthodox Christianity as a religion, because there was no church worship and all, it was a very hidden act during the Soviet period. Many of the churches were destroyed also, but it emerged with vengeance in the post-Soviet state. All the states, not just in Russia, but post-Soviet states. So they take Orthodox Christianity very, very seriously. And one of the reasons many people believe that why Putin is very concerned about Belarus and Belarus and Ukraine, because Russia, Belarus and Ukraine, they have the common origin, they follow the same culture, the language is also identifiable from the same root, the origin is Kievan Rus. So these are the ways through which Russia defines its cultural exceptionalism. But identity of Russia is also defined in terms of, as I told you, Westernizers, Slavophile, and Eurasianism. So Westernizers, the people, they think that Russia should become the part of the West. But Dostoevsky once said that if you cannot become the master in the West, so it's better to become the master in the East. So those kind of feelings are there, that if West does not accept you, so let's go to East. So we will be the master of the East, because we are industrialized and better than the East. So that feeling is there among the Russians. But there are people who also identify themselves as Slavophile because of the Slavic identity. And in Slavophile, apart from these three countries, Belarus, Ukraine, and Russia, Serbia, which was Yugoslavia, etc. So that is also a kind of Slavic root. So many of the states in Eastern Europe, they identify as Slavic, but Eastern Slav is actually these three states. So that gives another cultural aspect of this Russian identity. So, so these are the things which are exceptional in the case of Russia. And if you want to ask me, please do.
No. So I thank you so much, Rajan. We really enjoyed your presentation. I'll now be switching over to the audience question, and we have a bouquet of questions directed at you. And there's this gentleman who has joined us from Istanbul, really grateful. And he wants to know, Irhan is his name, if I'm pronouncing it right. Can we say that Russian interest is personified in the person of Putin? Who else define or endorse Russian interests?
Erhan Dogan, thank you so much for asking this question. He's a friend of mine in Istanbul, and Turkey is a major player. Turkey is a major player in this. Last meeting of foreign minister actually took place in Turkey, and Turkey also has close links with Ukraine because of trade and other things. And a lot of people from Russia and Ukraine, they go to Turkey for this tourist in the Black Sea area. So anyway, so the question was. That does Putin identify the national interest of Russia? Ideally,
the Russian interest is personified in the person of Putin.
So I get it. Yeah. So in my view, when you have a system which is very strictly authoritarian, you do not really the leader does not really represent the interest of a national interest. What you call it does not personify the national interest, but what the message goes from the state to the people, the other way around, top to bottom, the message goes that what he is doing is for the national interest. In my view, even today, if you take a survey in Russia, most of the people in Russia are against the war. They do not want this war to happen because they are the ones who are going to suffer. But the entire discourse narrative is being projected in a way that Russia will not survive. The threat, Russia as a state will be under threat if Russia allowed Ukraine to become the member of NATO. So national interest definitely cannot be personified by one leader, but the way national interest is projected in the narrative, the dominant narrative of the state. So Putin is very effectively doing that, and people are convinced that not NATO has to be halted for the interest of Russia. So that was my answer.
Yeah, thank you so much. I'm going to ask you three questions because they all have economics at the core of what they are asking. And I will begin by asking a question from my team member, Joshi Yogesh. He says that Ukraine is definitely suffering, but somewhere this war is also impacting Russia economically. Many major brands like Apple, Microsoft, Samsung stopped operations in Russia. Even the worldwide payment platforms are banned for Russia now. Many countries have imposed sanctions on Russia. Private assets of government people outside Russia are sealed. So that's one question, but hold on to it. And I have another gentleman called Shoaib Raza. He wants to know how long can Europe afford this aggressive nature of Russia and its backyard, and also whether it would retaliate or not owing to the energy and gas that it receives from Russia. And the last question in this series is from Shaheen Ansari, a fellow Genuite, and he says how this war is going to impact India and its economy. So three questions, and maybe you can talk a little bit about sanctions in this context.
Yeah, so the first question is about economic sanctions, whether it will impact Russia or not. In my view, it will have a massive impact on Russia. The kind of sanctions which have been imposed on Russia, so that is going to impact the life of the people. Now, even Indian people are going to suffer. Forget about the Russian people. Because many of the investments which were there, so they are backtracking, they are withdrawing. Ruble. Within a week of war, ruble crashed almost 30%. So if you want to go outside or if you want to trade with any other country, your value has gone down 30% in just 1 week. Investment is down. The share market, they are not opening because they think that it might crash. Most of the even popular companies like McDonald's and Apple, etc., they have withdrawn from Russia. airlines, the Aeroflot, which we used to think that this is a Russian airline, but because many of the parts are supplied by Boeing and American companies, so now it would be difficult for that airline to survive. Russian economy was anyway not doing very well, although Russian agriculture was doing better in the last few years. Military industry was also doing better, but many of the other sectors were not doing so well. Definitely people are going to suffer, and economic sanction will impact the life of people. There is absolutely no second question about it. What the second question of Shoaib is about what Europe can do. In my view, what the best thing that Europe can do is to have a ceasefire. If Europe can convince formally or informally either Zelensky or Putin that Ukraine is not going to be a member of NATO and we will maintain some kind of balance in the region, so that can lead to ceasefire in this kind of situation. Although, in my view, Putin, because he has invested so much now, now people will question the credibility of the leadership in case he does not achieve something good in Ukraine. So Putin is likely to escalate the crisis also, if in case he doesn't achieve the objective. In my view, Europe should put pressure on both the sides, and it should lead to ceasefire, and it should lead to resettlement of the people who have become refugees. All of a sudden, 6% of the people have become refugees, and if the war lingers on, the people who are going to suffer are the Ukrainian people. So Ukraine also has to realize that the war is very asymmetrical. Ukraine can fight, but you cannot fight an enemy without clear support from NATO if the enemy is so powerful and so big. And if the Kiev is surrounded, is under siege, so how long Kiev will survive, that is also a question mark. Now, 2 of the mayors have been abducted, they say, by the Russian army. So many of the leaders would be, under control of Russia, and that will influence the people's opinion also. So, European countries, even India, Turkey, Israel, China, they should play a very proactive role, because we are suffering because of this crisis. Our oil price has gone up, $630 billion. We're going to spend extra on energy because of this crisis. So inflation has gone up. The value of rupee has also gone down a few rupees in the last few days in comparison to dollar. So all of us are going to suffer. And so we should put pressure on different parties to hold a ceasefire and go for negotiation.
Yeah, so thank you very much. And we have an interesting observation. So Vidya Sarvesan is a professor of English literature at IIT Jodhpur, and she says that the famous poem by Lord Tennyson called "The Charge of the Light Brigade" was dedicated to the Crimean War soldiers. That's just an observation that came. I thought I should read it out.
Thank you so
Pawan
much.
Swanaji has been is a professor, ex-chairperson of the Women's Commission at Jaipur. She says, how to stop war and peace should be regained. Kindly suggest some possible solutions. Your time is a little short, so I'll read out a few questions you can answer. Then we have Alka Aditi saying, with Ukraine crisis, how does it affect the Southeast Asian region, and why haven't they responded to this as yet? Abbas Razvi says, seeing how Ukraine wants to join NATO and the European Union, how would that affect the quality of life of the ordinary Ukrainian? Would it also give them more security in the future? And one question from Professor Hari Nair from BITS Pilani, and he says, in fact, he has quite a few questions, but maybe we can take up 2 questions. What are the reasons for British Russophobia, and what is the rationale for NATO expansion? Is it for commerce of the Western war corporations? And he thanks you for a brilliant presentation as well.
Okay, so let me start with this British phobia of Russia that Professor Hari Nair that asked me in the last question that you read. So what is the rationale for NATO? In my view, NATO was a decaying institution during the Trump administration, because Trump pursued a policy of American isolation, and he started asking money from Germany and other alliance partners, also Japan, etc. So people started thinking that if American isolationist policy continued, he followed economic isolation and also military and this political isolation. So NATO started feeling threatened. NATO's legitimacy was under threat, under question. So Biden administration thought that if it has to play an active role in Europe at least, and Europe is the primary region for United States. Please remember, US hegemony cannot be continued if Europe does not remain the part of American alliance system and American liberal order. So because that was being threatened, so Biden administration sought to revive NATO by giving legitimacy to NATO by a kind of engaging in this kind of crisis also. Rationale for NATO is, in my view, NATO should not have NATO's security will not increase if it includes either Ukraine or Georgia. All right. In a state, if Ukraine becomes part of NATO, NATO will be facing a Russian army. So I just fail to understand how NATO will be more secured if Ukraine becomes a member. British security threat is very historic. Also, remember the two countries which actually fear the most in Europe, Russia. The two countries which fear Russia are one is European Britain, and the second one is United States. So they are very, very concerned about the rise of Russia. They think that many of the countries in Europe might take side of Russia, especially Germany, because Germany has very close historical cultural ties with Russia. Marriages of princes and monarchs, etc., is a very common practice. So they think that if Germany becomes very powerful and it decides to go with Russia, so that will threaten American influence on. So two of the policies of United States, one is to keep Russian down, but also German down in European security architecture. So that's American policy. Russophobia is very old in Britain. So because of the Tsarist region, because also remember that in India the British Empire fought 3 Afghan wars, and 3 Afghan wars against whom? Because they thought that Russians are going to come in Afghanistan. So, but that phobia was imperial. That phobia was also because of the Cold War period. So the British phobia is very prominent. Very, that the Russophobia is there. Similarly, the British phobia is also there in the Russian mindset. The question of Professor Rana, how peace can be established, that's a very difficult question, and it is beyond my competence. A diplomat would have answered this question in a right way, but I'll make an attempt. Ceasefire, number one. And then you have to take into account the security interest first of Ukrainian, then followed by Russia and NATO. So if you take these things into account, some kind of agreement can be reached. And the fact that these countries remained in the last 3 decades, they remained more or less in peace. So it can be established again if those steps are taken. The question of Alka, that how will it impact the Southeast Asia region? Why are they silent? In my view, Southeast Asian countries are waiting and watching, because the theater before this war was Southeast Asia and Indo-Pacific, where you might have heard that Quad was active, the AUKUS, the alliance of US, Britain, and Australia, that took place. AUKUS alliance, military alliance, and United States thought that probably it would contain China. And Southeast Asian countries are also very small states and divided states. They have agreement with China, economic agreement. They RCEP, Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement. They have with Southeast Asian state, where Japan, China, Australia, etc. are members. So they have close economic ties, and now they will fear, these Southeast Asian states. They will fear that if Ukraine cannot be saved by NATO or by the European countries, which actually is the bordering state. So whether America will save Southeast Asia or not. So those questions are there in the mind of Indians. Those questions are there in the mind of Southeast Asia also. So please remember that we are going to witness a different kind of world order. And I personally believe that China is going to be far more assertive in the Southeast Asia. Southeast Asian countries are silent because, like India, they are also divided between China, Japan, United States. So they are divided. Next question is, how will NATO expansion impact the life of Ukrainian? I think for Ukrainian, I do not think NATO could have led to something kind of major change in the lifestyle or per capita income, etc. NATO could have provided a sense of security, which they enjoyed with different regimes in different historical periods. But beyond that, I do not see that NATO could have led to major change in the economic. And NATO would not have, NATO is not an economic union; it's a military organization. So I think, in my view, Ukraine could have remained neutral, and that was better for Ukraine. Rather than Ukraine could have taken the benefit from both the sides, like Moldova, for instance, like Austria, or the number of states, Sweden, Finland, which are neutral, which are not part of NATO, and they are still secured. Russia is not attacking Sweden. Russia is not attacking Finland also. So Ukraine. I don't think was going to gain much from NATO. Actually, it has lost. Now, the statehood of Ukraine is totally questionable. Thank you. So these were the questions, I think, Mugdha.
Yeah, thank you, Professor Rajan, very, very much. It was a really very insightful, uh, discussion. One would not want it to end because there's still so many questions that one would want you to answer, but probably we'll have to do a part two because this looks, as per your own observation, this looks like it's going to be a long drawn thing. And we all know that peace follows war, and war happens only because there is a deep insecurity for peace and balance. So we will hope that the peace can be established sooner, and the people on both sides, which are the ones which actually suffer, the citizens suffer. The citizens can be brought peace on both sides of the border, is what we pray from this forum. World peace and humanity and universal brotherhood. Harmony and peace for everyone is our prayers from this platform. So thank you very much. And I hope the audience has enjoyed this session today. At least you've had a very, very factful understanding of what is going on. Of course, there will be opinions on all sides. But I'm very happy to also tell the audience that please reserve the March of 26th. We are, as I told you in our earlier sessions, that we have started 2 new streams in our discussions. One is focused on geopolitics. So we will be getting you more sessions, and we have 2 more sessions in the same series for people who've joined us only recently. Please subscribe to our Facebook page because it will give you updated information on all our new sessions. You can also follow us on Instagram and LinkedIn and various other places to keep updated. And I'm also very, very happy to tell you that the next session is going to be on Dida, the warrior queen of Kashmir. The reason is that apart from the geopolitics vertical that we have started, in which we'll be talking later on Afghanistan, with experts discussing books and what is happening, historical background. We will also be taking up Latin America region, which is very, very important and lesser known to our people. We'll be talking of literature, culture, and a whole lot more, because very recently in the budget in Kerala, they've decided to set up a Latin American center, maybe of interest to people who are working on Latin America. The other vertical that we have started is celebrating Indian women from historical times, and that was the invite for the next session that we will have on the 26th of March. We will be starting from Kashmir, talking of the warrior queen Dida. She makes for a very, very interesting reading, and I'm sure all our viewers will join me in celebrating the famous women of India, be it historical kings and queens, be it women in literature, be it women in science. So please do join us and subscribe to our channel. And once again, thank you, Rajan, very, very much for doing this conversation for us, and to all our lovely audiences who have joined us tonight, taking out time from a very, very busy and hectic, I'm sure, schedule that most people have on weekends. So thank you once again.
Thank you so much, Mugdha, and also Rajasthan IS Association for giving me this platform and opportunity. I'll look forward to doing it again. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. And Tarika has a question on refugees. Yes, our heart bleeds for refugees everywhere. And we hope that people who are working to bring peace are able to do it sooner for the sake of the people that are involved, irrespective of what country, what race, what ethnicity they belong to. So thank you, Tarika, for that observation. Good luck and good night, and we'll catch you soon later this month. See you, all the best. 21st of March is Poetry, World Poetry Day. We are hoping to bring you a session. So also reserve 21st, so there'll be some nice poetry happening to celebrate the World Poetry Day. If not, then that on the 26th, of course, we'll see you for Dida. Thank you once again. Good night, good evening, all the best. Enjoy yourself.